Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. As I mentioned before, just a few weeks ago, North Korea stunned the world by detonating its fourth nuclear device, and it crowed about the fact that it was a hydrogen bomb, and therefore it was now part of the big leagues. The big leagues include not just powers that have the atomic bomb, but powers that have the hydrogen bomb, the ace in the hole. We're talking about the United States, England, France, Russia, China, a very elite club. Well, first of all, what is the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb? Well, the difference is a factor of 100 to 1,000. The Hiroshima bomb, for example, dropped on Japan in 1945. It did kill about 100,000 people, but the magnitude of the detonation was a little bit over 10,000 tons, equivalent of TNT. So that's 10,000 tons of TNT equivalent compared to a hydrogen detonation, which can easily unleash 1,000,000 tons of TNT. For example, if you were to drop an atomic bomb, a Hiroshima-type bomb on Manhattan, you could, of course, take out a good chunk of Midtown and Manhattan itself, but the rest of the greater New York area would remain largely untouched. Damage, of course, would spread everywhere, but the main damage would be concentrated near the epicenter of the detonation. But if you drop a hydrogen bomb, a 1 megaton hydrogen bomb on the Empire State Building, let's say, in Midtown Manhattan, the consequences would be devastating. You're talking about firestorms and blasts and radiation going all the way out to Connecticut, New Jersey, throughout Westchester, the Jersey Shore. Not just Manhattan and the confines of New York City, but the entire greater metropolitan area. And how many people live in that radius? Well, upwards of 20 million people could be either killed, burned, or injured with the dropping of the hydrogen bomb. So what's the difference between them in terms of difficulty of manufacture? To make a plutonium bomb or uranium bomb, first of all, you have to mine uranium. You put it in a reactor, and then you can extract plutonium from the reactor, and you have to have it purified. And that's one of the main reasons why many nations do not, mercifully, have nuclear weapons. It takes a nation state to be able to mine the uranium, enrich the uranium, process it, and then create the nuclear triggers, which, like a watch, have to be set off exactly right to set off an atomic bomb, either uranium or plutonium. For example, the Hiroshima bomb was made out of uranium, and the Nagasaki bomb was made out of plutonium. Now, the North Koreans have a reactor, the Yongbyon reactor, and it produces plutonium out of which they've been able to extract enough for perhaps, we don't know for sure, perhaps 10 to 20 atomic bombs. Now, that's an atomic bomb. A hydrogen bomb is a two-stage device. It uses the atomic bomb as a trigger. That's right. The Hiroshima bomb is just a trigger for the much more powerful hydrogen bomb. It is extremely difficult to make a hydrogen bomb. It, too, is like a very delicate watch that has to be synchronized with the explosive force migrating microsecond by microsecond across the hydrogen bomb. Now, it turns out that the father of the hydrogen bomb was my mentor and advisor, Dr. Edward Teller. The father of the hydrogen bomb actually took me under his wing when I was in high school and throughout my education when I was at Harvard. In fact, when I graduated from Harvard, he even made me a job offer. He offered me a job either at, Los Alamos, where they made the first atomic bomb, the Livermore National Laboratory, which designs hydrogen warheads, or perhaps MIT. Well, I think I disappointed him, because I told him that I was really not so much interested in atomic bombs. Because, after all, there's an even bigger explosion, which is much more scientifically interesting, and that is the Big Bang. and the creation of the universe itself. Now, to create a hydrogen bomb requires much more sophistication, a much greater military-industrial complex, and technological infrastructure. First of all, you have to extract tritium gas from a reactor, which is radioactive. You have to combine it with deuterium in just the right quantities, and you have to trigger it without essentially blowing the whole thing apart. Now, the sun is a gigantic hydrogen bomb. It's made mainly of hydrogen, which is squeezed, and it's squeezed by gravity. It starts to heat up, and until it reaches, let's say, millions of degrees centigrade, when it reaches that point, then hydrogen combines to form helium, releasing energy via Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. So a hydrogen bomb is the stuff of stars. The universe, in fact, is set aglow by the force of all these hydrogen bombs going up and out of space. They don't, of course, rip apart the universe because gravity compresses them and localizes the gas. Now, in a hydrogen bomb on the Earth, you have to do the same thing. You have to, one, explode the atomic bomb, which heats up the deuterium and tritium hydrogen gas, but then you have to compress it at the same time. Gravity does both. Gravity compresses it and heats up the gas. However, in an atomic bomb, the atomic bomb is, of course, dispersive. Everything is blown to kingdom come, but you have to compress it. And that's where the difficulty comes in. How do you explode the atomic bomb, extract the heat from the bomb, and yet at the same time compress the hydrogen gas? That's a secret that was unlocked by my advisor, Dr. Edward Teller, and only a handful of nations on the Earth have mastered this technology. So in other words, it probably was not a hydrogen bomb that was detonated. And we know this for several reasons. First of all, it was a 5.1 earthquake that was set off by this nuclear detonation a few weeks ago. And that is in tune with the previous detonations, which were also around the range of 4 to 5 on the Richter scale of earthquakes. If it was a genuine hydrogen bomb, the energy release would have been 100, perhaps 1,000 times greater. And we simply didn't see that at all. So the bomb was simply too small to be a true hydrogen warhead. Now, if it wasn't a true hydrogen bomb, then why did the North Koreans advertise it as a hydrogen bomb even before the detonation took place? Well, there's several theories about this. The simplest theory is that not many people know the difference between an atomic and hydrogen bomb. They simply want to beat their chest, and it was mainly for domestic consumption, not for propaganda around the world, which was a secondary consideration. The primary consideration was to make the people of North Korea believe in the leadership, that the leadership was protecting them against the boogeyman, and that is the United States. Another theory says that, well, maybe it was what is called an enhanced weapon, that it had a little bit of tritium to give a little bit of boost, but not the terrific boost you would get from a full-blown H-bomb detonation. But that, too, failed. But as an enhanced weapon, it was a dud. It didn't detonate as scheduled. But, of course, in order to save face, the atomic scientists would have to beat their chest and say, see, we did it after all, even though it was, in some sense, a dud. Now, in all fairness, we have to now talk about the politics behind what is happening in the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans say, with some justification, that it's a one-sided debate because it's the United States, not North Korea, that is fully nuclearized. It's the United States that is loaded with all the hydrogen bombs. And so that's why some people say the obvious solution to defuse the crisis is denuclearization. That is, create a nuclear-free zone for the Korean Peninsula. No atomic or hydrogen bombs for North Korea, and no nuclear weapons for the United States as well. Denuclearize that whole area. That would be the obvious solution. But of course, how do you convince the North Koreans to sign on to a denuclearization? It's going to be difficult because the North Koreans saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. They saw what happened in Libya. They see what happens to dictators who are not popular around the world. In other words, there's no Social Security, there's no retirement program for ex-dictators. Ex-dictators usually go out feet first in a casket, or they die in office. Very rarely do ex-dictators write their memoirs, have libraries named after them, and have statues dedicated in loving memory of them after they die. No. Dictators are shot, dictators are assassinated, or dictators simply die in office, or dictators are pushed out, like what happened to Saddam Hussein. So the North Korean leadership, let's be blunt about it, sees the atomic bomb as an insurance policy. An insurance policy that the United States is not going to topple that government. Now, speaking about toppling the North Koreans, there was actually one moment in time, the last moment in time, when the United States could have used military force and perhaps gotten away with it. And that was during the Clinton administration. When Bill Clinton was president of the United States, the option was given to him: send cruise missiles into the Yongbyon nuclear reactor before it produced enough plutonium to make even a single atomic bomb. Well, there are risks involved, to be fair. Seoul, for example, is the capital of South Korea, and it is within invasion and firing range of North Korea. The North Koreans can easily shell Seoul, and in fact even send troops and occupy Seoul weeks before the United States could muster a counter invasion to what's going to happen to Seoul. In other words, South Korea, large portions of the South Korean economy will be destroyed if the North Koreans retaliate because the United States sets off a war. Well, that's the calculus that was presented to Bill Clinton. On one hand, Bill Clinton could simply wait, let the next few presidents deal with it, and it would be inevitable that the North Koreans would eventually get the atomic bomb, ICBMs, and perhaps the capability of lobbing these ICBM-driven missiles into California. That was the choice that Bill Clinton made. That is, risk the possibility of war today versus risk the possibility of war 20 years hence. Well, Bill Clinton chose the path that allowed North Korea to perfect its Yongbyon reactor, from which enough plutonium has been extracted, analysts believe, to create perhaps 10 to 20 atomic bombs. Now, some people say that the real solution of the problem is not to be found in Washington at all. It's to be found in Beijing, because the Beijing government literally could have a stranglehold over the North Korean economy. All they have to do is turn the spigot on the oil into North Korea. The North Korean government will fall, and, well, that's the end of the problem, right? Wrong. You see, China has its own calculus to figure out. It realizes that the North Korean government is unpopular. It knows that the North Korean people are starving to death, both for knowledge and for food. But the North Korean government, if it were to fall, would send millions of refugees into China and also allow the South Koreans, and hence the United States, to take over North Korea and put perhaps American troops right on the border with China. That's their nightmare scenario. Well, looking at the self-interest of all these different nations, one possibility is to, A, put pressure on China. Not enough that China begins to feel that we are interfering in its internal affairs, but to tell the Chinese people that it's in their interest. It's in their interest to either reform the North Korean government so that it becomes more democratic, so that it begins to feed its own people and become less paranoid, put pressure on them so there would be a peaceful transition so that we would have a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Well, of course, that's a wish list, a pretty long wish list. No one expects that to happen, but there is a third way. And that is the United States and China working together to reduce tensions and to convince the North Koreans to embark upon a nuclear-free zone so that the North Korean government doesn't go the way of Saddam Hussein. And if you've been watching television, you know that we're gearing up for the Oscars. And one science fiction movie that's way up there on many people's list is The Martian, starring Matt Damon. Now, usually when a physicist like myself watches science fiction movies, we have two reactions. A, we cringe. We cringe because, of course, the laws of physics get thrown out the window in order to create these exciting special effects on the silver screen. But also, hey, we're human too. We realize that when we were children, many of us were inspired by science fiction. For example, Carl Sagan was inspired reading about John Carter of Mars. That science fiction series, written by the same man who created Tarzan, Edgar Rice Burroughs, intrigued Carl Sagan to the point that he decided to become an astronomer. And speaking about astronomy, the greatest astronomer of the 20th century was Edwin Hubble. The Hubble Space Telescope is named after him. And Hubble was originally destined to become a country lawyer in Missouri. His father had pretty much groomed the son to take over the family business in law. But you see, when Edwin Hubble was a child, he read Jules Verne, and he caught the bug. He loved science fiction. And so he dropped his law practice, went to the University of Chicago, got a Ph.D. in astronomy, and went on to discover the expanding universe, which gives us the Big Bang Theory. So that's right. The Big Bang Theory owes its origin, in some sense, to a young child reading the work of Jules Verne. And many scientists today say that when they were young, they saw Star Trek, they saw Star Wars, and they were fascinated by the possibilities that science opened up, especially when science is applied to explore the universe. But let's now break down The Martian to see what he got right and what he got wrong. First of all, I'm not going to give away the whole plot, but it starts off with astronauts facing a dust storm on Mars, a dust storm so fierce that it almost topples their rocket ship. But one of their crewmen, Matt Damon, they think has died because of the damage caused by this massive dust storm. They leave him behind, thinking that he is already dead. Well, first of all, is that possible? And the answer is yes. Mars, in fact, has planetary dust storms. The entire planet can be engulfed in one huge, humongous dust storm. And could it topple a spaceship? Well, I don't know about that. But definitely dust storms are going to be something that future astronauts will have to worry about when they explore the red planet. Next, Matt Damon finds himself injured and running out of air, running out of water, running out of food. It looks as if he's going to die because the next refueling mission won't come for another 2 to 4 years. Now, is that correct? And the answer again is yes. It turns out that there are windows of opportunity that opens up once every 2 years in order to shoot an object to the red planet. That's because Mars is in an orbit outside the orbit of the Earth. And so when the Earth comes sneaking up on Mars, traveling at a faster velocity, you can fire a space probe that will go then directly to Mars. If the Earth is on the other side of the solar system and were to shoot a space probe, the trajectory would be much different, and you can calculate using Newton's laws of motion that the best time to fire a rocket at the red planet is when we're creeping up to the red planet, traveling faster than the Martian planet, and then taking advantage of this window of opportunity. Next, Matt Damon has to worry about air. He's running out of air. Where can you find air on Mars where the atmosphere is mainly carbon dioxide? And that is water. It turns out that Mars has plenty of water that is frozen solid. You can use a heater to melt the ice, take the liquid water, separate out oxygen. In fact, there are other chemical processes that will allow you to do this as well. And you can then breathe that oxygen coming out of water. The water, of course, can also be used to drink, and that would solve the problem of being thirsty on Mars. But what about growing crops on Mars? 2 years is an awful long time to wait. Well, there's no soil on Mars. There's no soil at all. in fact, is just airless, lifeless dust on the surface of Mars. So, even if you have seeds, you have to have fertilizer. And where does the fertilizer come from? Well, this may gross some of you out. The fertilizer comes from its own solid waste. That's right, we humans create fertilizer. It's called night soil, and many peasants from around the world still use night soil to fertilize their crops. And then the last question that you have to ask is, can plants really survive on the red planet, even with fertilizer? Well, you have to realize that there's plenty of carbon dioxide on Mars. In fact, most of the atmosphere on Mars is made out of carbon dioxide, and plants love carbon dioxide. And so, in other words, The Martian is actually one of the few science fiction movies that actually adhere to the known laws of science. And also, let me say a few things about the aging process. Several years ago, there was a fad that said that sharks don't get cancer. Well, that was a fake. Sharks do get cancer. But elephants rarely get cancer. And scientists now know why. Because elephants are bigger than us, they should have more cancers rather than less cancers, because the density of cancers in tissue, in mammalian tissue, should be roughly the same. And yet, elephants noticeably have fewer cancers. And they found the reason why. There's a gene called P53. It's a very long gene. And when it breaks or mutates, oftentimes cancer results. Well, it turns out that we have two copies of P53, one from our mother, one from our father, protecting us against cancer. In fact, broken P53 genes are implicated in half, 50% of all common cancers can be linked to a breakdown in P53. Well, elephants have 20 times more P53 than us. And that could be the breakthrough. It means that P53, when it functions normally, is functioning at a much higher rate in elephants than in human beings, and therefore 50% of all common cancers, you would see a drop in their incidence. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that's great, but what about other animals? And what about human beings? Can this technology apply to other animals as well? Well, that's what scientists are doing now. They're looking at the DNA of other large mammals, thinking, again, that large mammals should have more cancers because the density of cancer in tissue should be the same across the mammalian evolutionary chart. So far, they seem to have indications that, yes, other mammals also have a decrease in cancer with an increase in P53. Now, why don't we simply inject it into us? Well, it's not so fast. Genes, of course, can be manipulated, but the way in which you manipulate them is very problematic. For example, if you were to inject a gene into your body housed in a virus, it turns out the body will react to the virus and try to kill the virus, killing the good gene as well. So inserting a good gene into your body is not so easy. This is called gene therapy. And in fact, gene therapy has had mixed results. There are only a tiny handful of diseases that can be cured using gene therapy, which is to inject the good gene housed in a virus into your body. Viruses, what do? They infect ordinary cells with their DNA. That's what viruses do. And so in some sense, the virus will be infecting your body with the good gene. Well, it sounds great, right? But oftentimes the gene winds up in the wrong place. And more than often, it turns out that the body will actually attack the viral coating, even though it's harmless, thinking that it's a dangerous virus, when actually that same virus could in fact save your life. So in other words, we have a long ways to go. Well, once again, in the second half of Exploration, we'll be bringing on an expert on the aging process, Dr. Jay Olshansky. So today, we're going to separate fact from fiction, and that's especially important because now the baby boomers are hitting retirement age, and as a consequence, because they have retirement money, disposable cash, and a certain amount of wherewithal, perhaps they'll be spending their money, in fact, wasting their money, chasing after cures which simply do not exist. And so today we'll talk about the science of the aging process with Dr. Jay Olshansky. Well, I'm afraid that's it for the first part of Exploration. In the second half of Exploration, we're going to bring on our special guest today, Professor Jay Olshansky, an authority on the aging process. And we're going to talk about fact and fantasy. All the remedies you hear about in the drugstore, do any of them pan out when we talk about real science rather than Madison Avenue hype? Welcome. In the second part of Exploration, we'll talk about the aging process. Our special guest today is Dr. Jay Olshansky, one of the world's leading authorities on the aging process, author of the book, The Quest for Immortality. And we're going to try to separate the hype from the reality of what's happening inside the universities and learning centers of the world. Now, of course, the search for immortality is not a new one. In fact, one of the oldest texts of all time, predating the Bible, is the Tales of Gilgamesh. In fact, many of the passages from the Tales of Gilgamesh were later incorporated into the Bible. And what was Gilgamesh doing? Well, it turns out that he was searching for the Fountain of Youth. And so the search for Fountain of Youth is an old one, dating all the way back to prehistory. Not to mention the fact that in Asian folklore, Emperor Qin was the first emperor to unify China in around the year 200 BC. However, even though he could conquer as far as the eye could see, he could not conquer the wrinkles on his face. He was getting old. And so, to conquer the aging process, he assembled all his princes and explorers, and he gave them a mission. Go out and find the Fountain of Youth, or don't come back. Well, obviously they did not find the Fountain of Youth, because Emperor Qin did in fact die. However, since they couldn't come back, perhaps the princes and explorers of Emperor Qin went on to found Korea and Japan. Not to mention the fact that Ponce de Leon was searching for the Fountain of Youth, and instead he found the great state of Florida. So it's an old dream, but it's a dream that has drawbacks. First of all, we have not found anything resembling the Fountain of Youth, but we also have Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, we have the legend of Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Well, goddesses, of course, are immortal, but she had the misfortune of falling in love with a mortal, Tithonus. And so she pleaded with Zeus, the father of all the gods, to give the gift of immortality to her lover. Well, Zeus took pity on the goddess of the dawn, and so he granted her wish. And in fact, Tithonus became immortal. However, Eos made a big mistake, a huge mistake. She forgot to ask for the gift of eternal youth as well. And so her lover simply got older and older and older, but could never die. That was his fate. And so people who search for immortality also have to wonder, will we suffer the fate of Tithonus? If we start to live forever, will we live forever in decaying, dying bodies that cannot die? Well, now we have genetic engineering. And now we have a much deeper understanding of the molecular biology of the aging process. And so with us today is Dr. Jay Olshansky, who will talk to us today about why do we have to get old? And now I'd like to bring on our special guest for today. We're very delighted to have with us Professor S.J. Olshansky. He's a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's also a research institute at the Center on Aging at the University of Chicago. Well, if you've been to the drugstore, you've probably been hit with all these advertising saying that you can retard the aging process, even roll back the hands of time, live longer, they say. But what about the truth? The truth about human growth hormone, antioxidants, massive doses of vitamins and minerals and herbs and supplements. What about the hardcore truth and scientific verification of these claims? And also, what about genetics? We seem to be teasing apart many of the genes that influence the aging process. So once again, we're going to bring on our special guest today, Professor Jay Olshansky, and he's the co-author of a book called The Quest for Immortality. So that's the subject of today's discussion, immortality. Now, I understand that today you and other prominent scientists have issued a policy statement, a recommendation of sorts that could have serious and beneficial economic benefits. Could you elaborate?
Yes. This is based on an article we published in The Scientist back in March of this year with Rich Miller from the University of Michigan, Dan Perry from the Alliance for Aging Research, and Bob Butler from the International Longevity Center in New York. And we basically suggested that the time has arrived for societies, not just the United States, but really all nations, to begin investing in an effort to slow the biological process of aging in people. And the logic and the rationale is fairly straightforward. Basically, what we're suggesting is that even a small deceleration or slowdown in the rate of biological aging of just a few years would actually yield huge economic and health benefits. I mean, think of it this way. The way the NIH is currently set up is essentially to deal with one disease at a time, independent of all others. But if you can find a way to slow down the biological process of aging, you would essentially postpone everything that is negative associated with growing older into later and later ages. It would be as if you achieved a major discovery for every major fatal and non-fatal disease if you could find a way to slow aging. So we're calling on Congress to begin investing in a concerted effort to slow the biological process of aging in people.
Yes, in fact, the social benefits could be astronomical, especially as you look at the baby boomers that are hitting 60 and will eventually increase medical costs tremendously in this country.
Yes, I mean, the prevalence of conditions of frailty and disability will rise dramatically in the coming decades with the aging of the baby boom cohort. So slowing that process even a little bit would actually enable people to be healthier longer, contribute to the economy longer. They would just everything positive associated with aging. There are positive things associated with aging would be extended. So it would be an extraordinarily important event for national economies, for public health. Really, the time has arrived, I think. And not only has the time arrived, but the science is approaching the level at which I think we're beginning to gain enough understanding that we think we can do this in humans. We know we can do it in other animals. We think we can do this in humans.
Okay, now let's get back to Earth and talk about hokum, snake oil, and real science. If you visit the drugstore, you realize that there are whole shelves full of herbs and remedies and vitamins, making all sorts of promises about retarding the aging process, reversing the years. So let's now talk about the science, that is, what is known experimentally. Let's start with the Internet, where we have lots of advertisements for human growth hormone. Now, in some sense, are the people of America being used as guinea pigs for this gigantic experiment on human growth hormone, or what are your thoughts?
Well, actually, people are using themselves as guinea pigs. It's absolutely remarkable that, you can go on the Internet and find every conceivable nutritional supplement and hormone, including growth hormone, with people with no expertise in the field claiming that it can slow, stop, or reverse the biological process of aging. And people believe this. They spend enormous sums of money. They order this stuff over the Internet. They inject themselves with it or take these pills. And there isn't a shred of evidence that it'll make you live any longer. There actually is some evidence, some suggestive evidence that some of these substances, including growth hormone, have the potential to actually shorten your life. So it's remarkable that people are conducting a biological experiment on themselves. It doesn't mean that there isn't value necessarily to some nutritional supplements, particularly for people who are deficient in certain vitamins and minerals. There's no question that there is a benefit for those individuals. But if your diet is so bad that you're deficient in some major vitamin or mineral or something, that these vitamin supplements aren't going to make up the difference. It simply isn't going to work. And there's no evidence that it actually extends life.
And what about the side effects of human growth hormone? Some people think maybe cancer or other kinds of diseases associated with accelerating metabolism. It's like a sports car. If you were to accelerate a sports car, you throw off a few gears here and there. And that, of course, means cancer, because cancer in some sense is genetic errors. But what are your thoughts about side effects of human growth hormone?
Well, first of all, it has been demonstrated that there are some benefits, believe it or not, associated with growth hormone, including increased muscle mass and reduction in the rate of bone loss and improved skin elasticity. So you can't deny the fact that there have been benefits associated with it. But accompanying those benefits have been risks, including carpal tunnel syndrome, increased risk of diabetes. There is suggestive evidence that it might increase the risk of cancer. The fact is that it hasn't been properly studied yet using clinical trials in humans. And so before those clinical trials are in, before we know what the results are, it's really premature to be using these kinds of substances. And again, once again, with the case of growth hormone, there isn't any evidence that it extends life.
Okay, now moving on, when you go to the drugstore, you see these advertisements for mega vitamins. Some claim that it retards the oxidation process. Other people cite certain studies which show that if you ingest certain diets rich in vitamins, it seems to be good for you. But what about the pure form of vitamins that you buy in the drugstore?
Well, once again, the nutritional supplement industry is really working hard to convince us that aging is somehow caused by either the loss of some hormone or the lack of nutritional supplements of one kind or another, and they're perfectly willing to sell you everything that they can to try to convince you that you can somehow influence this process. And it's based in part on science, where it's suggested that aging is influenced by oxidation, and this oxidation process can be slowed down in theory with the ingestion of certain nutritional supplements that have antioxidative effects. But there isn't any empirical evidence that demonstrates that these substances actually extend duration of life. So once again, it's the same scenario where people are selling something with exaggerated claims, with a profit motive in mind, and people are buying it up like crazy.
And what about herbs? Some people say that maybe pure vitamins that are refined by the chemical companies may not simulate vitamins in the natural forms. So what about taking herbal medicines? What is known or not known about herbs?
Now, honestly, I don't know that much about herbs and herbal medicines to comment on that. But what I can tell you is that there's plenty of evidence that eating more fruits and vegetables and can certainly lower your risk of a wide variety of diseases and disorders. And, of course, those in the supplement industry are suggesting that contained within those fruits and vegetables are certain substances that they can concentrate in a pill and give to you in a larger form, under the assumption that more is better. Well, there is where the evidence is lacking. The evidence is there that eating more fruits and vegetables is good for you. The evidence is lacking with the nutritional supplements containing the vitamins that they think are causing the beneficial effect. The evidence there is lacking that will have any significant effect.
Okay, now moving on, let's talk about something that actually does work. I think all scientists would say unanimously that there is one and only one proven way, in the animal kingdom anyway, of actually increasing the lifespan of animals. We don't know whether it works for humans yet. But let's talk about caloric restriction. First of all, what is it, and what tests have been done?
Well, you're right. This is the one intervention that's been demonstrated repeatedly to extend duration of life on a wide variety of species, It's basically reducing your caloric intake. It can, vary. The percentage can vary from anywhere from 10 to 30% below maintenance levels. So it would depend on what your current height and weight is. But, if your normal caloric intake is 2,000 calories to maintain your weight, you might be reducing it down to 15, for example, 1,500 calories. And no one exactly knows why it works or how it works, the underlying mechanism, but there is consistent research suggesting that it extends duration of life. Now, the question is, how does it do so? Does it extend duration of life by slowing the biological process of aging? Some people believe that to be the case. Others suggest that it actually extends duration of life by reducing the risk of a wide variety of diseases and disorders, which is not the same as slowing the biological process of aging. Remember, if you reduce the risk of heart disease, cancer, and stroke, however you do that, through exercise or diet, the aging process marches on. It's uninfluenced by that. But if indeed you're slowing down the biological process of aging, then everything negative associated with it is dragged to later ages. It's postponed to later ages. And that would actually be a wonderful thing if caloric restriction was the mechanism that actually worked. Now, don't expect, by the way, that people are going to be living longer by dramatically reducing their caloric intake. What the scientists are looking for is the underlying mechanism to find a way to mimic that process without actually reducing your caloric intake. It should be obvious, by the way, that in the United States and elsewhere, we're doing the exact opposite. We are increasing our caloric intake. We are growing more obese at a more rapid pace than we ever have in the past. So this research is particularly important and is interesting for a wide variety of reasons.
Okay, now caloric restriction works on yeast cells, spiders, insects, mice, and now for the first time we're getting the first preliminary evidence from primate studies done in Bethesda, Maryland. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those experiments, because primates, of course, are closer to us, and perhaps it may work on organisms as complex as us. But what are your thoughts?
Well, my guess is it probably will. I mean, the work of Richard Weinrich from Wisconsin and other researchers at NIH Bethesda have, I think, demonstrated quite convincingly that reducing caloric intake can lower the risk of disease. Probably it will extend duration of life. We have to wait for these animals to live long enough to determine whether or not that's going to be one of the consequences. But there are a couple of problems here. In some of the earlier studies, you need to remember that the control animals that were used in the caloric restriction studies were fed ad libitum, meaning they had as much food as they wanted, which is sort of like us. And so whenever you reduce your caloric intake relative to eating as much as you want, what you are demonstrating is more the detrimental effect of a gluttonous lifestyle rather than the longevity-enhancing effect of caloric restriction. So you have to be careful on how you interpret that. Now, in more recent studies, the control animals are not fed ad libitum. They are fed really more of a maintenance diet. And you're not seeing quite the large differences in duration of life in these two populations when you do it that way. Nevertheless, you do see reductions in the risk of a wide variety of diseases and disorders, and we would all be better off if we reduced our caloric intake. Whether it would work in humans at the level that we see in these other species, I think is highly questionable. And there's a real concern when, for example, you extend the duration of life of a fruit fly or a roundworm nematode by 3, 4, or 5-fold. It's real tempting for researchers to then multiply the human life expectancy by 3, 4, or 5 and suggest that the same effect, if it occurred in humans, would make us live hundreds and hundreds of years. My guess is we wouldn't see anywhere near that kind of magnitude, increase in magnitude and duration of life in humans. But if we could, live healthier longer for just, an extra 5 or 10 years, that would be huge.
Okay, now I understand that the animals that have been studied seem to be a little bit lethargic because they have such a restricted diet. They have less cancerous tumors, less incidences of diseases associated with the aging process, but they also seem to lack an interest in the sex drive. That is, all the things that make life worth living, joie de vivre. These animals seem to be pretty lethargic. Is that true?
Yeah, as I understand it, there is appears to be a price to pay. There appears to be lower fecundity, less interest in sex, and I think a difficult problem with controlling body temperature. These animals are cold. In fact, feel cold. And in fact, in the case of humans who are conducting this experiment on themselves, they're essentially reporting the same thing. So there is a price, at least for now, to be paid by adopting this calorically restricted diet, which is why, as I suggested earlier, reducing your caloric intake to these kinds of levels probably isn't the way it's going to work in humans. The way it's probably going to work in humans is that scientists will try to find some sort of mimetic, something that will fool the body into believing that it's calorically restricted to achieve the same effect without actually significantly reducing your caloric intake like that. And that's probably the way it will work, and it's extremely valuable and interesting research that needs to be aggressively pursued because there's such great potential there.
Okay, now let's leave the animal kingdom and talk strictly about humans. In your book, you mentioned the fact that the life expectancy for Americans at the beginning of the 20th century was not very long at all, less than 50 years of age. And yet there's been an increase into the 70s since then. Some people think it's sanitation. Other people think it's antibiotics and vaccines. But what are your thoughts about looking at the long-term life expectancy of humans going back to ancient days, through the Middle Ages, to the turn of the century, to present-day times?
Well, going back to ancient times, there's evidence to suggest that life expectancy, for example, during the time of the ancient Egyptians, was probably somewhere in the 20s. Nobody knows exactly where it was, but it's likely to have been in the 20s. We achieved a very small incremental increase over the millennia to the beginning of the 19th and 20th centuries, when life expectancy rose up to about between 45 and 50 in the United States, anyway. And then you saw this quantum leap in life expectancy during the 20th century from 50 to close to 80. And that was largely attributable to dramatic reductions in early age mortality, infant, child, and maternal mortality, principally as a result of sanitation, public health, refrigeration, foods, and so forth. It's, the introduction of antibiotics occurred after most of the declines in the death rates occurred at younger ages and contributed relatively a small amount to the rise in life expectancy in the 20th century. Now, in the latter part of the 20th century, there have been notable reductions in death rates at middle and older ages, even from heart disease, some forms of cancer. And so you see, two forces contributing during the 20th century: the early age mortality declines at the beginning, and the later age mortality declines at the end, which explains, by the way, why the more recent increases in life expectancy have been smaller than the ones that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. When you save children from dying, you add very rapidly to life expectancy. When you save middle-aged and older people from dying from fatal diseases, chronic fatal diseases, you add a relatively smaller amount.
Now, it turns out that Japanese women have some of the longest life expectancies on the planet Earth. It's almost approaching 90. So we're talking about 50% of Japanese women essentially getting into their late 80s and into their 90s. Some people say it's diet, a fish diet that's low in fat. But what are your thoughts about the demographics of different societies?
Well, first of all, for Japanese women, it's just above 85. It might be approaching 86. And you have to realize that there's a huge difference between 85 and 90. It's not the same as between 50 and 55. And the reason is fairly straightforward. To raise life expectancy up when you're at these very high levels is extremely difficult because you're pushing up against the basic biological process of aging itself. There's no question that subgroups of the population, such as those in Okinawa, Japan, for example, have much higher life expectancies. The actual force involved is not yet understood. It's not like we can, here in the U.S., adopt the lifestyle of the Japanese. I know some people have suggested this, including some friends of mine who study the Okinawa diet, suggested that you can somehow get Americans to live as long as the Okinawans by adopting this particular lifestyle. And there's no evidence to suggest that that would be the case unless, of course, we were all Japanese here in the United States, and that isn't the case. There are genetic factors that are influencing the risk of death and duration of life, and those are things that we simply cannot control, at least not yet anyway. But there's no question that subgroups of the population do experience greater longevity than other subgroups, and that is a fascinating area to study, by the way, because it would appear as though there are genes that exist within the human genome that influence duration of life, and they may be more highly concentrated in some subgroups relative to others.
Okay, now let's talk about genes, because that's, of course, where most of the breakthroughs are being made in the last few years. Again, there's no fountain of youth. No one in the genetics area is claiming to have solved the aging process, but there's been lots of very interesting studies. First of all, there's something called progeria, a genetic disease that's been intensely studied in which children die of old age. They look like plucked chickens, and they die of heart attacks as teenagers. Could you elaborate on that very strange disease?
Well, it appears on this, progeria appears on the surface anyway to be a phenomenon of accelerated aging, but there's evidence to suggest it is not. There are lots of things that don't occur in these children that occur in the aging phenotype of individuals who actually do make it out to older ages. So I would be cautious about thinking of progeria as accelerated aging. It is certainly interesting to study these individuals, and you have to realize that it's always easy to do something to yourself that will accelerate aging. I mean, we do it all the time, quite frankly. And one of the arguments that I've made for many years is that the only control we have over the duration of our life is to shorten it. And we exercise that control all the time when we adopt lifestyles that are, where we expose ourselves to the sun, or we don't exercise, or we smoke cigarettes, or use drugs. These are the kinds of things that can make us die at much younger ages than would otherwise be the case.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku for Exploration. Join us every week when we discuss the cutting edge of science and how it impacts on society. Good day.